Us as NBA fans spend the majority of our time judging players, ranking them. What we don't have enough of are team rankings. So your boy is here to save the day and give a completely subjective opinion on who the greatest teams of all time are. So y'all know me. I'm all about the stats. From my research, there are no ways to possibly metricize every NBA team of all time to compare them, thus why this is an opinion-based video. Anyhow, to incorporate some sort of statistical addition to this, I'm going to have three main ways to judge these teams. The first being regular season success. This branches off into regular season net rating, which is the team's points produced per 100 possessions minus the team's points allowed per 100 possessions. The second is the exact same thing, except for the playoffs. The third is basically my opinion on the roster. I split it up into three parts: star power, depth, and coaching. I'm sure all you guys can figure out what those are. Finally, although this should be taken with a grain of salt, I'm going to be combining all of the factors into one number. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video.
Anything's possible! Anything's possible!
So the first team we have on this list is the 1949-1950 Minneapolis Lakers. And as you can tell, not every single team is on here. To make this simple for everyone, I just made it so that if you didn't win a championship, then you don't get in. And I didn't add every single championship team because, well, that'd just be a lot of teams. And especially the 60s Celtics, I don't want 11 60s Celtics teams on here, so I just narrowed it down to the best. And of course, you're not going to see the 2015-2016 Warriors because obviously they choked, and even though they had a historical regular season run, they didn't win the NBA championship, so just to make things simple, like I said, I am not adding them. In any case, we do have the 1949-1950 Minneapolis Lakers, and I'm going to put them in the high-tier championship teams. The 1949-1950 Minneapolis Lakers, this was of course the George Mikan era. And this dynasty had more talented rosters and more deep rosters, but I just feel like this one played the best together. They won by an average of 8.4 points inside the regular season and 9.1 points inside the playoffs, which is really good. They went 51-17 inside the regular season, which is a 75 win percentage, and then they went 11-2 inside the playoffs, 1-0 in the first, 2-0 in the second, 2-0 in the third, 2-0 in the fourth, and 4-2 inside the finals. So although this team was absolutely amazing, it really was just not a deep team at all whatsoever. It was really only three guys that were carrying the load, being George Mikan, Jim Pollard, and Vern Mikkelsen. So because of that, and because this team just isn't as good as most of the other teams in this list, I am going to put them inside the high-tier championship caliber teams. The 1961-1962 Boston Celtics. Sub-GOAT championship teams. So this was the franchise's 5th NBA championship, so it was on the first side of the 11 that, of course, Bill Russell won, and this is, of course, when they still had Bob Cousy, and guys like Sam Jones and Tom Heinsohn and Tom Sanders were still not in their prime yet. This team was immensely deep, and they won by 7 inside the regular season and 4.8 inside the playoffs, and while those numbers aren't absolutely heart-wrenching, this team was definitely known as more of a clutch team, and they always got it done, judging by the 60-20 regular season record. We all know the star power was good, we all know the depth was absolutely amazing on those Celtics teams. I'm talking about every single one, and of course they had Red Auerbach as their coach, which is a 10 out of 10 coach in my opinion. Next up is the 1963-1964 Boston Celtics, elite championship team. This was kind of the transition period for the Celtics dynasty, although they were still winning championships, so I don't know if you want to call it that. But Bob Cousy, he had retired at this point, and the reins were kind of being given to guys like Sam Jones, Tom Heinsohn, Tom Sanders, and Casey Jones, and then of course you still got Bill Russell, who was along for the whole ride. Next, of course, is the 1964-1965 Boston Celtics. This was the prime of that dynasty. This is their absolute best. They were amazing. GOAT championship team. This is a team that had a 6.9 net rating inside the regular season and won by an average of 7 points inside the playoffs. They went 62-18 in the regular season and 8-4 inside the playoffs, and this is a team that of course had amazing depth, of course had amazing star power, and of course had debatably the best coach to ever step on the floor. Now 1965-1966, this is the final Bill Russell-led Celtics team, and this is when the team started to, go downhill a little bit, as debatably their best scorer obviously left the roster, and that left a big hole in them. However, still an elite championship team. That team could beat almost every single team on this list. Next up is the 1966-1967 Philadelphia 76ers. And although this is probably going to be the most controversial pick on this entire list that I've made, GOAT championship team. This team was absolutely nothing short of stacked. Of course, they had Wilt Chamberlain, who at this point was worrying more about winning, and of course it paid off as they won the NBA championship. Of course, they had Hall Greer, Chet Walker, Luke Jackson, Wally Jones, Larry Costello, and of course Billy Cunningham. This team was absolutely insane. They went 68-13 in the regular season, 11-4 in the playoffs. It was 3-1 in the first round versus the Royals, 4-1 in the second round versus the Celtics. They beat the Celtics 4-1, insane, and 4-2 in the finals versus the Warriors. This is the team that had good depth, nothing amazing, but their star power was almost unmatched. So although that's a debatable pick, I am 100% sticking with it. Hello, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you. You deserve a break, cause there ain't nothing at stake. You like my rhymes? Probably not. Don't worry, me neither. I'm a metalhead, so please like this video and subscribe. The entirety of the video took me like 200 hours to make, so it would literally mean so much to me if you guys obliterated those two buttons on the YouTube we all love to hate. Anyways, break's over, back to the video. Next up is the 1969-1970 New York Knicks. So this one was tough. I wanted to put them in the sub-GOAT championship teams, but I just don't feel like they're at that point. And when I looked at that entire list, or that entire rank, I just felt like this team couldn't compare to those. So, elite championship team. Now that is not a knock at them in the slightest. This team is absolutely amazing, thus why I put them in the third highest tier, but this team didn't exactly blow out every single other team inside the league. This team had guys like Walt Frazier, obviously Willis Reed, Dick Barnett, Dave DeBusschere, and Bill Bradley, but their depth wasn't anything outstanding, and they really didn't dominate inside the playoffs despite their 16-22 record. Nevertheless, an all-time great team, that is why they're on this list. Next up, the 1970-1971 Milwaukee Bucks. This is a very, very, very confusing team, and I will show you why in a second, but sub-GOAT championship team. Now on paper, this team doesn't exactly jump out to you, but I mean of course they had Kareem, they had Oscar, they had Bob Dandridge, they had John McLaughlin and Greg Smith. This was a good team, but the way that they played, this one season, this is a one championship dynasty. Well, it's not even a dynasty I guess in that case, but you know what I'm talking about. What I'm trying to say is, this team was a one-hit wonder, and I don't mean that lightly. This was a one-hit wonder. This team had 10.8 net rating inside the regular season, and they won by 14.5 points inside the playoffs. This team steamrolled through the playoffs, 16-2, 4-1 in the first round, 4-1 in the second round, and 4-0 inside the finals versus the Baltimore Bullets. There was absolutely no stopping this team. I don't care how stacked this team was on paper, this team in my opinion is a sub-GOAT championship team. Next up, the 1971-1972 Los Angeles Lakers, and this was the year after the 70-71 Bucks won the championship, obviously because of the year. Sub-GOAT championship team. This team had a 10.5 net rating inside the regular season. They didn't blow out teams in the playoffs, they only won by an average of 3.2 points, but they did win the championship and they went 12-3 inside the playoffs, which is very, very good. And obviously, if you don't know, this is the season that Elgin Baylor retired halfway through, and of course they won their first and only championship in the 70s. Jerry West, Wilt Chamberlain, Jim McMillan, Gail Goodrich, and Happy Hairston. This was a good ass team. Now for the second New York Knicks team, and the only other New York Knicks team on this list is obviously the 72-73 New York Knicks, and the exact same as the 69-70 New York Knicks. Willis Reed was on his downturn, but they of course got Earl Monroe to kind of fill that void, and this team was a very, very good team, just like the previous Knicks team that I mentioned. Now for the 1973-1974 Boston Celtics. Now there was a lot of parity in the 70s, I think we can notice that by this list, and of course if you do know the NBA quite well, then you would know that there were a lot of different teams that won inside the 70s, it wasn't just dominated by 2 or 3 teams. So in that case, ultra high tier championship team for this team. They were good, but they were definitely, I don't want to say underdogs, actually I do want to say underdogs, they weren't exactly favored to win it. They didn't have an absolutely stacked roster, they didn't do insane inside the regular season or anything, but a very, very good team nonetheless. And speaking of parity, we have the 1978-1979 Seattle Supersonics, most commonly known as the only real team to win without a superstar. This team they were very well rounded, but I mean compared to all the other teams in this list, besides obviously the 49-50 Minneapolis Lakers, I just don't feel like they're at that point. However, they are still a high tier championship team. This was an absolutely outstanding team for those of you who didn't know about them. Now for the 79-80 Los Angeles Lakers, this is going to be the first sub-elite championship team. This is of course Magic Johnson's rookie season. This was the start of that dynasty. They weren't exactly stacked at this point, but they did have Jamal Wilkes at that point, and Kareem was closer to his prime at this point as well. And another noteworthy thing to add, which a lot of you might know of, is Kareem was injured inside that final game of the final series, and that made this team that much better that they were able to pull through without their best player. Now for the 1980-1981 Boston Celtics, very similar case to the 1979-1980 Los Angeles Lakers. These two teams, as you know, would go head to head basically all through the 80s, but this team was a step below the 79-80 Lakers. They're an ultra high tier championship team. This team is mostly known for their depth. They didn't have a ton of stars, as either their future stars, Larry Bird and Kevin McHale, they were kind of up and coming, and they had veterans like Tiny Archibald, and well, Robert Parrish was the only guy really in his prime in this team. But this team was obviously not at its peak yet, but they were a very, very good team. I'm going to cut off part 1 of this video right there. I split this video up into 2 parts because I did not want a half-hour long video. But if you have any disagreements with any of my choices, because this obviously was a subjective video, drop them down in the comments and drop me your entire list if you want to, and I want to see people fight in the comments. If there's no fighting in the comments, I'm going to be very disappointed. I want to see lots of disagreements down there. But if you want to be notified for the next part of this video, make sure to hit that sub button, obliterate it like I mentioned earlier, and like the video if you loved it obviously. But thank you buddies for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next part.